Hi, I'm the Multifarious Fisherman. This is 7Fish, and the goal of this video is to teach you why do we run tungsten, when do I run fluorocarbon, when I'm ice fishing. We're going to give you more information than you ever wanted to know about two chemical compounds. Tungsten is represented on the periodic table with a W, which is kind of weird, but not uncommon. Lead is Pb, gold is Au. Original name for tungsten, and still recognized in some areas in Europe, is wolframite. Tungsten is a metal that is really heavy and really hard and very unreactive as a general rule. I believe tungsten was first kind of theorized and recognized in the late 1700s by a scientist in Sweden. Tungsten is Swedish for heavy rock, which tungsten is a pretty darn heavy rock. It is 1.7 times the weight of lead, and that is why it is used quite a bit in the fishing industry. Two reasons. It is non-toxic. Lead, of course, has many known issues in terms of impact environmentally and with your body, and tungsten is pretty inert as a material. It's not easily affected by or reactive with water or air. It's impervious to a number of different acids. It's an interesting compound. It is heavy and hard in certain configurations, and it's used for a lot of stuff. Tungsten by no means unique to the fishing industry. In fact, that's a small portion of what it's used for. Because it's not very reactive, it is used as an electrode in TIG welding. TIG welding, in fact, stands for tungsten inert gas welding. Some of the other applications are with compounds made with tungsten. Tungsten carbide is made from powdered tungsten and carbon, and you'll see that a lot in tools, drill bits, things like that, where you need something that's very hard. And there's a little bit of a trend right now going around the internet, people buying cubes made out of pure tungsten and doing different things with them, dropping them off towers and hitting them with stuff and shooting at them and all kinds of things. Tungsten is also used as a material in armor-piercing rounds for the military. Tungsten had a part in the filaments for a lot of incandescent bulbs, which they've kind of fallen out of fashion, but were very popular when I was younger. It has an extremely high melting point. Its melting point somewhere in that a little over 6,000 degrees Fahrenheit, which is crazy hot. So it's an interesting element, but we use it primarily due to the fact that it is hard, non-toxic, and not reactive, so it doesn't rust in water and whatnot, and heavier than lead. When they used to make ice fishing jigs out of lead, to get the weight that they wanted, they made the heads a certain size. Basically, if you're running a larger lure size, a lot of times the fish will reject it because it doesn't appear to be real. The bigger something is, the easier it is to recognize flaws in it. So when fish are a little bit negative, you may want to go to a smaller size to keep from putting fish off. Tungsten gives you the same weight in a little bit more than half the size of lead. It's 1.7 times heavier than lead. Tungsten is significantly more expensive than lead, both to get a hold of because it's a pretty rare element, and it's also more expensive to work. So it is you can't melt it down in your I mentioned 6,000 degrees. You can't melt it down and cast it in your garage like you can with lead, although certainly the potential health effects of melting and breathing the fumes from melting lead are not necessarily beneficial. On the other side of the fence, fluorocarbon is a pretty broad term. It's used to represent a lot of compounds that involve fluorine and chlorine. When I was young, there was some concern about greenhouse gases and things affecting the ozone layer. The material that they were mainly worried about was called chlorofluorocarbon. It was kind of the first exposure I had to fluorocarbon. Chlorofluorocarbon is different. It's a gas and it goes up into the ozone. They used it in aerosol cans, and when it was released, they were concerned it was making a hole in the ozone layer. You don't hear about a hole in the ozone anymore. Originally speculated that it couldn't be resolved, but the Earth takes care of itself. But we did get rid of chlorofluorocarbons, which is a good thing. They were problematic. Fluorocarbon, as we know it in the fishing world, is used to make fishing lines, and it's one of basically three categories of fishing line. You have fluorocarbon, you have monofilament. Copolymer monofilament fishing line is a traditional, clear plastic fishing line that you're used to talking about. As it applies to ice fishing, when you look at fluorocarbon line, a couple of properties stand out. Fluorocarbon is something that I myself use for tungsten. When I am fishing tungsten jigs with bait and I'm trying to be very small and very unobtrusive, especially when I'm fishing clear water, a couple of features of fluorocarbon really stack up to in my advantage when I'm fishing that style. When I'm fishing an action bait, what I call an action bait, you're talking about baits where you're putting action into that bait, like a rip and wrap, like a jigging wrap, like a jigging spoon. Those kind of baits, you're moving all the time, you're putting action into, and fluorocarbon really isn't necessary for those style of baits. There are a couple of features that some guys like for it, but it certainly doesn't give you any giant advantage. Some guys will choose to run braid for that, and that's a perfectly good application. One of the things about braids, they can bring a lot of water up with them because of the nature of how they're made. There's some void and some texture to the surface, and water can ride that line up into your guides and ice your guides up if you're fishing when it's really cold. So the braid can come into the reel wet and actually freeze and kind of try to stick together in the spool, which is problematic. So a monofilament or a fluorocarbon, especially if you're fishing outside of a hut when it's real cold, might be a little bit better choice. Certainly I don't have a problem with monofilament for action baits because a lot of times you're fishing a lighter line setup, and the little bit of stretch that monofilament has sometimes can be a little more forgiving when you're fighting a fish. And let's talk about the properties of fluorocarbon before we get too far afield. Fluorocarbon has a similar refractive property to water, which is what makes it very hard to see underwater. Monofilament bends light differently than water and is more apparent when you're underwater looking at it. Sometimes you can hide some of that by running a slightly colored monofilament so that you don't notice the light bending as much, but to be honest, fluorocarbon will give you the most invisible line that you can run underwater. And that's honestly more important when you're ice fishing and the fish take some time to look at your bait. Again, less critical when you're running a jigging spoon or a rip and wrap or something where they're generally moving and the fish are hitting it because of that movement. They're not taking a lot of time to sit and stare at that bait. There's a lot of talk about monofilament and fluorocarbon, the fluorocarbon being less stretchy than monofilament. And that's kind of a misnomer. Fluorocarbon actually stretches as much, maybe even a little more in some cases, than monofilament, but it stretches differently, and that's kind of a weird thing to say, but monofilament and fluorocarbon, when they're dry, have similar stretch percentages, but different properties. Monofilament, when you stretch it, it stretches, and it stretches right away. You know, it's kind of shock absorbing. Fluorocarbon is, the molecules are packed quite a bit denser than monofilament, and because of that, that's part of the reason it sinks, because it's heavier, because it's more dense. But it also, it doesn't like to let go of that stretch. Slow application of force to fluorocarbon can cause it to stretch a decent amount, but quick application of stretch to fluorocarbon will not stretch as much as monofilament. That works two ways. Number one, a quick bite on one end is less likely to be absorbed by fluorocarbon. But whereas a bite on monofilament may be absorbed by the stretch of the mono and be less noticeable at one end. But the downside to that is with fluorocarbon, a sharp application of force, especially let's say on short line, if you have a fish right at the hole and he gives a big head shake or something, that it can be a little more susceptible to breakage. So you may want to run a rod that is flexible and will help protect that line so it's taken up by the flex of the rod and not applied directly to the fluorocarbon. Knot strength is similar for both. They're not particularly one advantage over the other, but fluorocarbon is more susceptible to heat generated while you're tying the knot. Another advantage of fluorocarbon, it is not affected by UV light. Monofilament is pretty famously negatively affected by UV light. There's a lot made of the abrasion resistance of fluorocarbon, and it's accurate for the most part. The abrasion resistance of some monos can be relatively low. They get dinged up, nicked up pretty easily. So the main reason that we use fluorocarbon lines, and I already mentioned I don't worry about them with action baits. I don't really worry about them with dead sticks either, because you don't gain any sensitivity with the rod knot in your hand. And there's no real reason to spend the money on fluorocarbon line for those applications. We talk about tungsten being heavier than lead, and we're spending maybe 3 times as much on a tungsten jig as we do on a lead jig. So we've spent that money to try to get good sink rate with a small size. And then we tie our monofilament to it. Monofilament floats in water. As your jig sinks and it's pulling that line down, it's pulling more and more and more monofilament underwater. So as that jig falls, it's being offset by the buoyancy of the monofilament. And theoretically, your tungsten could fall far enough to a point where the buoyancy and the sink rate or the weight of that jig equalize and the jig stops falling. So when we're running these little tiny tungstens, and basically all of my tungsten rods are spooled with fluorocarbon. The reason I do that is fluorocarbon sinks. It's a little heavier than water. It won't make your jig fall faster, but what it will do is it won't slow your jig down. A tungsten jig on monofilament will fall from 0 to 5 foot at a certain rate. And from 50 to 55 foot, it'll fall at a much slower rate because it's pulling that monofilament down. It doesn't matter how much fluorocarbon you have because it's not buoyant. So you'll never reach a point where that jig slows down. So the fall rate from 0 to 5 and from 50 to 55 will be exactly the same. And your overall fall rate will be faster because to reach those deeper depths, it just doesn't get slowed down by that monofilament. Those are the reasons you run fluorocarbon, and those are the reasons you run tungsten when you're ice fishing. Hopefully the chemistry lesson wasn't too boring, and hopefully it was helpful to you to understand why is it that we run fluorocarbon, why is it that we run tungsten. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you with another video here in a couple of days. We're going to have a little, I don't know, let's call it a science lesson.